Hi, you're watching Body Matters Australasia. I'm Lydia.
And I'm Sarah.
And we're a team of psychologists and psychotherapists who specialise in disordered eating and body image issues. So today we're going to be talking about the difference between eating disorders such as anorexia and bulimia, disordered eating and dieting. It's really interesting to us that currently industrialised nations are framed as existing in the midst of an obesity epidemic. And what we've noticed as practitioners in the field is that, often the behaviours prescribed to those who are labelled obese, the solutions prescribed to those labelled obese, they're the same behaviours we're diagnosing in people with clinical eating disorders. If you think about being encouraged to count every calorie, every fat gram, weigh every gram of food, count every step in the pursuit of health, or for most people that means in the pursuit of thinness, there's a strong overlap between both extremes. And so we established Body Matters to address what we see to be an epidemic of disordered eating, which includes the extremes of eating disorders and obesity, but a whole range of problematic eating issues or disordered eating that exist in between those extremes that include things like serial dieting, comfort eating, chronic overexercising, and so forth. And it occurred to us that, when a society actively promotes, encourages, and normalizes body hatred and body shame, certainly we can expect an epidemic of disordered eating.
And in fact, the types of disordered eating that actually exist in our society, maybe it would be worth you thinking about some of the disordered eating that you experience on a daily basis in terms of the people that you interact with. I was just talking to a friend the other day who was visited the doctor because she had been on a diet. She was actually visiting for another reason, and the doctor reviewed her diet, which basically consisted of soup and toast, vegetable soup and toast. And the doctor said to her that she needed to include some protein in there just to meet her nutritional requirements. And the poor girl ended up in tears at the doctor's because the concept of including protein was so terrifying for her. Now, she was actually in normal weight range. The doctor would have had no idea that she was struggling with eating in the way that she actually was. On a clinical level, on a regular basis, Lydia and I are speaking to school kids who are living in a culture where eating lunch just isn't the norm. And so particularly, for example, all-girls schools, there's kids that are going to having lunch at school and none of their friends are actually eating. I guess that's disordered eating as well, as far as I'm concerned. In fact, often these kids that restrict their food and don't actually eat during the day end up going home and having a massive feast when they get home. And some of you might find yourselves doing this or recall doing this when you're at school, that you come home, the first thing you do is look in the cupboard, and if there's not any high-calorie food there, you yell to your parents, "Mum, there's nothing to eat," even if the cupboard's actually filled with food. So it's just food that is not what we're craving when we've restricted food all day.
And I think you've hit a really important point here. We've all heard about how diets don't work. And one thing that we're not told is not only do diets predict binge eating, they also are a significant predictor of future weight gain. And how does that make sense? Well, we know that from an evolutionary perspective that, in times of famine, the ancestors that would have survived would have been the ones who would have obsessed about food, who would have been motivated to seek out food. The ones who sat in the background picking their toenails would have died out. And certainly, having worked with people with clinical eating disorders, we've had people with anorexia report having dreams about food because their bodies are so malnourished. Your body actually goes into survival mode where it does almost everything in its capacity to keep you from starving yourself. And in fact, if your physiology overrides the desire to stop eating, that is actually a good thing. Your body is actually trying to protect you. And so when we go on diets, our bodies don't know that it's 2010 and that thin is in. Our bodies think, it's famine time. I'd better turn up the hunger signals, turn up the urge to eat. And so this is where what Sarah is saying comes into place where, okay, you know, maybe for some people they've skipped breakfast for the day and then they had to work through their lunch hour. They come home, the first thing they're going to do is eat 3 times as fast, 3 times as more, because, you know, we're kind of wired that way. And in terms of future weight gain, our bodies are designed to aim for homeostasis, which means that it aims to keep things as they are. And so when you deprive yourself of food, your body engages in compensatory behaviors to get you back at your natural weight, to get you back at a healthy place. And so in the long term, dieting actually leads to your metabolism rate slowing down and future weight gain.
And I guess this also highlights the point that people who engage in disordered eating don't necessarily have eating disorders. So what Lydia is talking about with physiology, so maybe an urge to eat a lot of food based on the pattern of eating throughout the day or throughout the week, it's quite normal that people's bodies will encourage them to eat a lot of food just because they haven't been eating, and that doesn't necessarily mean that someone has a mental illness. In fact, there's a number of different types of disordered eating. So, for example, one might be people eating past satiety or fullness, so stopping, not being able to stop eating, perhaps because they're just serving much bigger portion sizes than what they require. Other people might engage in comfort eating.
Using food to regulate their emotional distress. So we do see a lot of that at the hospital.
Often working within the field of eating disorders, we see people who are exhibiting the symptoms of disordered eating and perhaps on the pathway to developing an eating disorder who aren't actually being diagnosed as having a problem. And one of the issues that we experience is that early intervention often does not take place because the diagnostic criteria for eating disorders is so strict. And so we hear countless accounts of people being turned away when they're presenting to doctors with an eating disorder, being told that they're not thin enough to have an eating disorder, or they're too fat to have an eating disorder, or you know, they're not binging frequently enough to have an eating disorder, and that's really concerning. The education around eating disorders really needs to improve, particularly in medical professions, because I guess we would not see with other illnesses such as cancer, we would not see someone being told to come back when their tumour's bigger. And this is something that we really need to take seriously, that disordered eating and dieting in particular is the biggest risk factor for the development of an eating disorder.
And I think that it's a really important point to just emphasise that there are a lot of fantastic doctors out there who, you know, do know enough about eating disorders to refer people on even when they don't meet the strict clinical criteria for, you know, actual clinical eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia. But at the same time, if you're someone who deep in your heart knows that there's a problem with your eating and you've been turned away by a GP, it might be worth just going and getting a second opinion.
And similarly, if you've sought treatment through a psychologist or a counsellor or a dietitian, and again you've had the same feedback that they don't think that your problem is serious enough, but you sense that it is actually very serious, then we'd really encourage you to try and access more treatment.
And one last thing I wanted to really highlight is that, you know, whether it's disordered eating or a clinical eating disorder, your weight is only one component of that. The majority of people who do have clinical eating disorders are not emaciated. You know, that's a real media stereotype. Very few people are so clinically underweight that they're incredibly bony. So please do not feel that you have to be absolutely skeletal in order to qualify for help or to even ask for help. Whatever weight you're at, you deserve help, you deserve treatment, and it's something that we strongly encourage you to seek if you feel that you're struggling with an eating issue. So I guess one of the questions that we wanted to put out to all of you today was, what are your experiences of disordered eating? At what point do you think eating becomes a problem? Do you have to wait until you meet the strict criteria for a clinical eating disorder like anorexia or bulimia? Is it being, you know, massively overweight that's the issue, or is there some grey area in between that where you can sense that the eating is actually becoming an issue because it's dominating your life and perhaps impairing your life to such a degree that you're no longer able to feel good about yourself and go about your days as you'd like to. So put your comments in the comment section below. We'd love to hear from you. So this is Sarah and Lydia from Body Matters Australasia,
where everybody matters.